I'm Doug Cuny and this is my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make no-knead naturally leavened bread. Now before I get started, I want to cover a little bit of science. I know some of you out there are saying, I don't want to hear this technical stuff, just show me how to make good bread. Now you don't want to approach this like most of us did high school. In other words, we memorized a bunch of facts long enough to take a test and then we forgot all of them. I think if you understand the science behind what you're doing, then there's no memorization at all. With a little experience, you know exactly what's going to happen. Natural fermentation is an organic process. You've got wild yeast, you've got bacteria, and they consume the starch and the sugars in your flour, and they make byproducts. They make things like lactic acid, they make acetic acid, they make traces of alcohol, and they make the CO2, the carbon dioxide, that makes your bread rise. Fermentation is affected by two things, time and temperature. And with some experience, you'll learn how to use both of these to your advantage. Early in the fermentation process, lactic acid is produced, and that's the flavor that we associate most with fresh baked bread. Later in the fermentation process, acetic acid is produced, and that's the active ingredient in vinegar. So that's where sourdough gets its sour flavor. So by learning to control time and temperature, you can take a single bread recipe and you can produce either a fresh sweet loaf of bread or a very, very sour sourdough loaf of bread, or anything in between. Because natural fermentation takes longer than fermentation with commercial yeast, you can actually use that added time to your advantage so you're not tied to the production of your dough. Traditionally, bread was made by kneading, which develops gluten strands and hold the bread together. That's time consuming and tedious. By making a wetter dough and allowing longer fermentation times, the fermentation itself actually develops the gluten that you would normally develop by extensive kneading. In addition, the longer times used in natural fermentation produce a lot of flavorful byproducts that aren't present in commercial yeast production. When I was first introduced to the no-knead process of bread baking, it was a revelation to me. Suddenly, baking bread went from being a pain in the ass to a sheer joy. I find it hard to believe that somebody else hasn't applied the no-knead method to natural leavened bread, although I haven't really found any recipes for it. Now, I'm not saying that I created this method, but this particular recipe I developed through my own experimentation and research. Because long fermentation works so well at not only producing gluten, but producing flavor, I've actually taken this process and extended it out over a 3-day period. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of work, but in that 3-day period, you probably only do about 15 minutes worth of work. The rest of the time, your dough is doing what it does best. It's fermenting. And while it's fermenting, you can go on and do whatever it is you're going to do with the rest of your life. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to say that I want to produce bread for Sunday brunch. So I'm going to start gearing up on Friday morning. Once you get used to using this process, you can alter the schedule to fit your own daily routines. So here's what you're going to need to make bread. If you don't have a bread starter culture, you're going to need to buy one, get one from a friend, or make your own. If you don't have access to a starter, check out my video on making your own natural bread starter. You'll need bread flour. You'll need whole wheat flour. You'll need a scale to weigh out ingredients. You'll need assorted bowls. You'll need what they call a bench scraper or a bread spatula. Now, sometimes those are difficult to find, and I've found that the thing that really works well for me is what's called a broad knife or a taping knife used for doing drywall. You can find them in a hardware store for probably under $10. You'll also need a Dutch oven with a tight-fitting lid. I like the cast iron style. If you've got one that has plastic handles, which a lot of them do, make sure that they're rated for at least 500 degrees. Most plastic handles are only rated to 450 degrees. You'll need kitchen parchment paper. You're also going to want something for your dough to do its final rise in. That could be a bowl, it could be a colander, or even a skillet if that's all you've got. I like these inexpensive plastic colanders because if I'm making multiple loaves of bread, I can stack them and store them easily. Now your starter is set out on the counter all day and it's fermenting nicely. You can see the bubbles in it. It's ready to use. So I'm going to show you how to make your leaven so that you can mix your leaven with your dough tomorrow. For this recipe we're going to be making a loaf of bread that has 500 grams of dry flour in it. So we're going to need a leaven that's 20% of that. So we're going to need a 100 gram leaven. When you make the leaven, it's going to be made the same way as the starter. It's going to be 50% flour, 50% water. Now in this case, I'm going to match the percentages of flour that I'm using in my main recipe. So it's going to call for 45 grams of bread flour, 5 grams of whole wheat flour, and 50 grams of filtered water. Now 5 grams of whole wheat flour is a very small amount, so for making the leaven for one loaf, if you want to just make it out of white flour, that's fine, but I'm going to go ahead and do it the way I normally would. So first we'll take the whole wheat and the bread flour and we'll mix it together. Now a good rule of thumb is for every 100 grams of leaven you're going to use a tablespoon of starter, and this starter is really ready to go. So we'll take about a tablespoon of it. Now don't get too worried about the measuring out the tablespoon. It's just roughly a tablespoon. And I'm going to put it in the water because that's the easiest way to mix it up. Now we've got our starter is dissolved in the water. Mix this up. Alright, at this point you can see that that's rather balled up, tight little wad of dough there. Now by tomorrow as it ferments, it's going to loosen up. And it's going to relax and get sticky, and it's essentially going to do the same thing that you see your starter do. So we'll cover up the bowl with some plastic wrap so that we don't get any contaminants in it. And at this point you can feed your starter, put it back in the refrigerator, and set your leaven someplace warm.